Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station, one man sneered, his suit sharp, his voice dripping with arrogance. But she didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her backpack, her gaze steady on the window, as if the mockery meant nothing. To them, Adriana Cole was nobody, just a woman in a frayed hoodie sitting quietly in seat 12F. But when the jet doors opened at Andrews Air Force Base, something happened no one could explain. A squadron commander froze, his voice cutting through the noise. "Shadow Viper, stand up." And in that instant, every F-22 pilot on the runway snapped to attention and saluted. Her. Who was Adriana Cole, and why did the most elite pilots in the world bow to her name? The first impression was all anyone cared about. The boarding gate at Seattle buzzed with the familiar chorus of rolling suitcases, impatient sighs, and clipped announcements echoing through tired speakers. Amid the blur of tailored suits and glossy travel bags, Adriana Cole blended into the background, almost invisible. Her hoodie was frayed at the cuffs, her faded jeans had lost their shape years ago, and her olive green backpack bore the kind of scuffs that told stories no one in that crowd cared to hear. To most, she was just another passenger. To some, she was an inconvenience. Margaret Sloan, the head flight attendant, noticed Adriana the second she approached the counter. Margaret had the polished look of someone who believed uniforms were more than fabric. They were weapons. With a smile sharpened like glass, she scanned Adriana's boarding pass and spoke in a tone dipped with disdain. "Economy class in the back." The words weren't instructions, they were judgments. Adriana simply nodded, accepting the sting without flinching. She had heard worse. She tucked the pass into her pocket and walked down the jet bridge. Quiet, deliberate, her shoulders neither slouched nor proud, just steady. Inside the cabin, the hierarchy was immediate. Business class passengers occupied their leather seats like thrones, drinks already in hand, voices carrying the confidence of people used to being heard. Adriana, by contrast, moved with care, her bag brushing against her leg as though she didn't want it to intrude on anyone else's space. She found row 12 and slid into 12F, the window seat, a place where she could face outward, let the clouds absorb her silence. Victor Hale, the man in the pinstripe suit with a Rolex glinting under the cabin lights, noticed her arrival. He leaned toward his colleague, his voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station." The remark drew a ripple of laughter. A few passengers smirked, reassured that someone had spoken aloud what they had already decided in their minds. To them, Adriana Cole was nobody, just a woman in a frayed hoodie who had wandered into the wrong room. She didn't react. Her eyes remained on the small oval window, her hands steady as they adjusted the straps of her backpack. Silence for Adriana was not surrender. It was discipline. Claudia Reynolds, a woman draped in a blazer, cut from wealth itself, glanced up from her phone. Her blonde hair was pinned with precision. Her earrings caught the light in deliberate flashes. She offered Adriana a dismissive smirk, the kind that required no words. For Claudia, acknowledgement alone was a form of charity. From the row behind, a sharp click of nails against a phone screen punctuated the air. Tasha Miles, the influencer, had already angled her camera to catch the flattering light. Her glossy red manicure gleamed as she typed, whispering something to her friend, Diana Cross, the woman with the silk scarf draped elegantly over her shoulders. Both laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively, as though Adriana were a background prop in their curated world. Adriana shifted slightly in her seat, not to confront, but to make herself more comfortable against the growing weight of other people's opinions. She pulled her hoodie tighter and leaned into the window. From the outside, it looked like retreat. From the inside, it was control. And here is where the story matters, not in the mockery itself, but in the way she absorbed it. Most people would have bristled, defended themselves, or shrunk into invisibility. Adriana did neither. She embodied something far more disarming, calm defiance. When Victor laughed again, Adriana reached for the bottle of water in her bag. She unscrewed the cap with a slow, deliberate twist, her fingers steady, the motion controlled. The plastic crackled softly in her grip, and that sound alone was enough to quiet the laughter for a beat. It wasn't a threat, wasn't a statement, but it was presence. Margaret Sloan passed through the aisle, her eyes sharp, her posture perfect. She glanced at Adriana, lips tightening just enough to show what she thought. Out of place. She moved on quickly, heels clicking, as if each step was an exclamation point. Yet Adriana didn't need their approval. She wasn't here to belong. She wasn't here to prove. And this is what most people miss. Sometimes strength doesn't come with shouted comebacks or defiant speeches. Sometimes it comes in the steadiness of hands, in the unshaken gaze fixed on the horizon, in the refusal to let ridicule dictate your posture. As the plane filled with the hum of conversation and the shuffle of passengers settling in, Adriana sat in silence, her presence both ordinary and somehow unyielding. No one in that cabin knew what she carried, the weight of missions flown, the scars of nights that bled into dawn, the call sign whispered only in places where lives depended on it. To them, she was just the woman in seat 12F. But the truth was already there, tucked quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment the world would be forced to see her for who she truly was. The plane had barely leveled off before the next test began. Elena Cole sat still in seat 12F, her posture calm, her hoodie pulled just enough to shadow her features. To an outsider, she looked like a woman simply enduring another long flight. But to the passengers around her, she was a canvas for casual cruelty, an easy target because she neither fought back nor sought attention. Across the aisle, a young woman with flawless makeup and a sleek black dress leaned forward. Her smile was wide, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be so excited to be on a plane like this," she said. The sentence sounded kind on the surface, but the tone betrayed her. This wasn't kindness, it was pity, sharpened into performance. Her name tag read Sabrina Langford, a rising attorney who had perfected the art of smiling while condescending. Her words carried just enough weight to invite others to laugh without her ever looking unkind. Elena didn't blink. She turned her head slightly, meeting Sabrina's gaze with quiet precision. Her eyes were calm, her voice softer than the hum of the engines. "It's just a flight," Elena said. 4 words, that was all, but they landed like a stone in still water, the ripples shifting the air between them. Sabrina's practiced smile faltered, just for a second, before she leaned back, pretending she had meant no harm. Around her, a few passengers chuckled nervously, but the laughter didn't spread this time. That was Elena's way. She didn't need to fight fire with fire. She only needed a whisper of truth, a reminder that words could cut both ways. And here's the thing most people miss. Silence is not weakness. It's a discipline forged in harder places than luxury cabins and petty insults. Elena's silence was armor, her calm a weapon sharper than any insult Sabrina could conjure. But the storm wasn't over. 2 rows ahead, a man loosened his tie, turned in his seat, and let his laughter pour across the cabin like cheap cologne. His name tag read Martin Ellison, a consultant who carried himself with the smugness of someone used to being the loudest voice in the room. "What's the matter?" Martin said, grinning as though the whole plane were his stage. "Don't tell me you're sitting by the emergency exit. Hope you're not the one responsible if we go down." A ripple of laughter followed, harsher this time, fueled by his volume. He leaned back, satisfied, certain that he had scored a point in some invisible game. Elena's fingers tightened slightly around her water bottle. She didn't rise, didn't snap back, didn't play the game on his terms. Instead, she lifted the bottle, unscrewed the cap with deliberate precision, and took a sip. Slow, measured, as though nothing he said had weight. Then she set the bottle down and turned her head, her dark eyes finding Martin's with unhurried calm. "I've worked near planes before," she said. Her voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't boastful. It was steady, like a door closing, softly but with finality. The laughter stumbled. Martin's grin wavered. For a moment he seemed unsure of what to do with the weight of her words, because in her tone there was something he didn't recognize, something grounded, something real. He cleared his throat, muttered something about jokes, and turned back to his drink. The cabin quieted just slightly. This is where Elena's power lived, not in shouting, not in proving, but in unsettling the very ground her critics stood on. She had no need to justify herself to strangers who lived in worlds of shallow victories. Her silence was its own judgment, and her calmness made their noise look small. Margaret Sloan, the flight attendant, passed by again, her sharp eyes catching the scene. She noticed Martin's forced chuckle, Sabrina's downcast glance, but Margaret herself carried no sympathy. If anything, she seemed annoyed that Elena had not folded under pressure. For Margaret, control meant order, and Elena's unshaken presence disrupted that balance in ways she couldn't quite explain. The irony, of course, was that Elena had been trained for this very thing. Not this plane, not these people, but pressure, real pressure. She had learned long ago how to breathe through the storm, how to stay steady when everyone else panicked. To her, a cabin full of smug passengers was just noise. She had lived through nights when silence meant survival. As the plane droned through the clouds, Elena rested her hands in her lap, calloused fingers tapping once against her seatbelt. A subtle rhythm, a reminder to herself. Control, always control. Sabrina shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her phone screen suddenly less interesting. Martin sipped his drink faster than before, his earlier bravado thinned to silence. And around them, other passengers began to sense it too. The quiet authority radiating from the woman they had mocked. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her past. They didn't know the call sign whispered in hangars far from civilian eyes. But they felt something they couldn't name, the weight of silence. And sometimes that weight is heavier than any roar. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a brief stop at Andrews Air Force Base for refueling. Please remain seated unless instructed otherwise. The announcement shifted the energy in the cabin instantly. Business class passengers perked up, as if someone had whispered the word exclusive. Jackets were straightened, hair smoothed, smiles rehearsed. For them, Andrews wasn't just a stop, it was status. Margaret Sloan appeared in the aisle, her uniform still pristine, her heels clicking against the floor, with the authority of someone who believed she owned the cabin. She held a list in her manicured hand and began speaking with a voice that carried to every row. A few of our premium passengers have been invited to step off briefly to greet the F-22 squadron. If your name is called, please prepare to disembark. She listed them one by one. Victor Hale, Claudia Reynolds, Tasha Miles, Diana Cross. Each name was a nod to wealth, power, or influence. Each person stood a little taller, basking in the attention. And then, as if to seal the unspoken divide, Margaret's eyes flicked to Adriana Cole. No words were needed. Her expression said it all. You are not on this list. Adriana remained still, hands folded lightly over her backpack. She didn't need Margaret's reminder. She was used to doors closing, used to being overlooked. Yet the sting wasn't entirely absent. It lingered like smoke. Victor Hale leaned across the aisle, his grin smug. Guess they don't hand out invites for hoodies and sneakers, he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few chuckled in agreement. Claudia Reynolds, adjusting her blazer, added in a stage whisper, "Can't exactly have someone like that representing this flight. Standards, after all." The comments landed like darts, sharp and deliberate. But Adriana didn't look at them. Instead, her fingers brushed lightly across the front pocket of her backpack. The old fabric carried an embroidered patch, faded, frayed, but unmistakable to anyone who knew. An eagle, wings spread wide, stitched years ago by hands that shook after missions that had nearly gone wrong. To most passengers, it looked like a cheap souvenir. To those with eyes trained by service, it would have meant something far more. But no one here noticed, no one cared. Ethan Carrington, a man in a tailored polo and designer watch, glanced over his shoulder with a smirk. He was younger than Victor, hungrier, the kind of man who built his identity on tearing others down. They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed for the bus station, Ethan said, echoing Victor's earlier sneer. His words were smoother, practiced, the cruelty of someone who wanted an audience. The laughter that followed was quieter this time, less certain, but it still pricked the air like needles. Adriana's response was the same as before. Silence. She adjusted her backpack, pulling the strap higher onto her shoulder, and rested her calloused hands in her lap. Those hands, hardened by years of gripping flight controls, by nights patching torn gloves in desert hangars, were invisible to everyone else. To them, they were just rough hands, the kind that betrayed ordinary. But to Adriana, they were reminders of who she had been, of what she had survived. The irony, of course, was that Margaret's carefully curated VIPs were buzzing with shallow excitement, while the woman who had once flown missions no one dared to speak about sat in silence, dismissed as unworthy. And here is the truth the cabin didn't know. The eagle patch on her bag wasn't decoration, it was history. Her calloused hands weren't flaws, they were testimony. As the so-called VIPs prepared to step off the plane, Claudia pulled out a compact mirror, touching up her lipstick. "Moments like these are about presentation," she said to Diana, her voice carrying just enough to reach Adriana's ears. Diana laughed softly, adjusting her silk scarf. "Well, some of us were born ready. Others," her eyes slid toward Adriana, "not so much." Adriana didn't turn. Her gaze stayed on the window, fixed on the tarmac below. Rows of sleek, predatory F-22 Raptors stood gleaming under the midday sun, their canopies reflecting the sky like shields. Ground crew moved with sharp efficiency, their gestures precise, deliberate. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly. The sight of those jets stirred memories buried deep, nights of radio chatter breaking into static, the roar of engines pulling her into the sky, the unrelenting focus of missions where every decision carried lives in its balance. Her fingers tapped once against the eagle patch on her bag, a private rhythm, a signal to herself. Stay steady. Meanwhile, Margaret guided the chosen passengers down the aisle. Victor adjusted his Rolex, Claudia smoothed her blazer, Tasha rehearsed a selfie angle, Ethan whispered another cruel remark. None of them noticed the shift in Adriana's posture, the subtle sharpening of her eyes as she gazed at the runway. None of them could imagine that the woman they mocked had once walked that very tarmac with a different uniform, a different purpose, a different name whispered in respect. And this is the paradox. The closer the truth stood, the more invisible it became to those unwilling to see. Adriana Cole sat quietly in seat 12F, dismissed, overlooked, ignored. But the jets outside gleamed like silent witnesses, waiting for the moment that would tear the mask off everything. For now, though, the cabin laughed, the VIPs strutted, and the world still believed she was nobody. The air inside the cabin shifted when the doors opened at Andrews. Sunlight poured through the jet bridge sharp and clean, carrying with it the scent of fuel and the low rumble of engines outside. Passengers craned their necks for a better look, eager to step into a world they thought was reserved for them. At first it was routine. Ground crew moved with the efficiency of a clock, their headsets crackling with orders. Then came the boots, black, polished, purposeful, marching in unison down the tarmac. And at their head was a man whose presence made the air itself still. Major Daniel Brooks, commander of the F-22 squadron. His uniform was flawless, his stride steady, his jawline cut with discipline. He boarded the aircraft to greet the so-called VIP passengers. Victor Hale extended his hand immediately, his Rolex catching the light as if it demanded respect. Brooks shook it politely, though his eyes were already moving elsewhere. Claudia Reynolds offered her rehearsed smile. Tasha Miles held her phone discreetly angled. Diana Cross clutched her scarf like it was a badge of elegance. But Brooks's eyes passed over them quickly. They weren't who he was looking for. Then he froze. His gaze locked on a woman sitting quietly by the window in seat 12F. A woman in a frayed hoodie, her olive green backpack tucked under her feet, her head slightly bowed as though she were part of the scenery. But Brooks knew better. His entire body stiffened, and for a heartbeat, the cabin was silent. His voice came, low at first, then cutting through the air like a blade. "Shadow Viper, stand up." The words dropped into the cabin like thunder. Every conversation died instantly. Victor blinked, confused. Claudia's smile faltered. Margaret Sloan, the flight attendant, stiffened in place, her polished composure cracking. Adriana Cole lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met Brooks's, calm and unflinching, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. She rose from her seat with quiet precision, slinging her backpack over her shoulder in a single smooth motion. Gas rippled through the cabin. Passengers leaned back, unsure what they were witnessing. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, pitied, was standing at attention under a call sign that carried the weight of classified skies. Brooks stepped aside, gesturing to the open door. Ma'am. His tone was not polite, it was reverent. Adriana walked forward, steady, her movements stripped of hesitation. She didn't glance at Victor, or Claudia, or Ethan Carrington, who suddenly found the floor more interesting than his phone. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. As she stepped onto the tarmac, the world transformed. Two full rows of F-22 pilots stood in formation, their flight suits crisp, helmets tucked under their arms. At Brooks's command, their voices rang out as one, "Attention!" And in perfect unison, every single pilot snapped to salute. Sharp, precise, absolute. The sound of gloves striking foreheads echoed across the runway like a drumbeat. Adriana stopped at the edge of the formation. For a moment, she simply looked at them. Men and women who lived and breathed discipline, whose eyes now held something more than respect, something closer to awe. She raised her hands slowly and returned the salute, crisp and measured. No pride, no arrogance, only quiet humility. The wind tugged gently at her hoodie, her dark hair catching the light as though to remind everyone watching that she was both ordinary and extraordinary. The passengers pressed against the windows of the plane, their earlier laughter silenced, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. The influencer's phone hung forgotten at her side. Margaret Sloane's lips parted slightly, as if she couldn't reconcile the woman she had dismissed with the legend now standing on the runway. From the formation, two younger pilots broke ranks. One was Lieutenant Parker, his boyish face barely hiding the weight of years compressed into missions. The other was Ensign Morales, sharp-eyed, his posture betraying both nerves and reverence. They approached Adriana slowly, as if stepping into sacred ground. "Ma'am," Parker began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You probably don't remember, but 3 years ago, over Kandahar, you covered our six. You got us home." His throat tightened, and he blinked hard. "I was the rookie in that flight. You saved my life." Adriana's gaze softened. She gave a small nod as though acknowledging not the praise but the bond. Morales stepped forward, clutching a small, worn logbook. He opened it carefully, revealing a signature across one faded page. Shadow Viper. "You signed this for me after my first mission," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd see you again." The wind carried silence over the tarmac. Even the engine seemed to quiet as though listening. Adriana rested her hand lightly on the edge of the logbook, her voice quiet but firm. "You made it back. That's what matters." Neither Parker nor Morales could answer. Their eyes shone with something beyond respect, a recognition that they stood before someone who had shaped their survival, their careers, their very presence here. Behind them, the formation remained locked in salute, their discipline unbroken. Yet in the stillness, an unspoken truth radiated. This was not a woman to be mocked. This was Shadow Viper. And Adriana Cole, the woman in the frayed hoodie, stood calmly in their gaze, humble, composed, utterly unshaken. Inside the cabin, the passengers finally understood. The ridicule, the whispers, the smirks. They all collapsed under the weight of the salute that was not given to them, but to her. The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Who was Adriana Cole? And why did the most elite pilots in the world bow to her name? The plane left Andrews Air Force Base with a silence no one could break. The passengers who once laughed now sat stiffly in their seats, their reflections in the oval windows betraying shame. Adriana Cole returned to 12F, slipping her backpack beneath the seat with the same calm she had carried from the start. No gloating, no smug glance toward those who mocked her. She simply rested her hands in her lap and gazed out at the sky, the same as before. But outside that cabin, the story had already begun to travel faster than the jet engines. Several passengers, eager to capture the novelty of standing on an Air Force runway, had their phones rolling when Major Brooks called out Shadow Viper. The footage spread like wildfire the moment they landed. It wasn't just the reveal of Adriana's call sign. It was the audible gasps, the shocked faces, and the entire squadron of F-22 pilots saluting a woman in a frayed hoodie. The internet devoured it, dissected every frame, and judged the arrogant commentary that had come before. By morning, there were consequences. Victor Hale, the businessman with the Rolex and the sneers, was the first to fall. His sarcastic remark about the bus station echoed across social media, replayed in thousands of clips. Within 48 hours, the defense contractor that employed him announced his resignation. Officially, he chose to step away. Unofficially, no company working with the military could afford to be associated with a man who had ridiculed a decorated veteran to her face. Tasha Miles, the influencer with the glossy nails and curated laughter, saw her world crumble differently. Her sponsors, watching the storm unfold, quietly severed contracts. By the end of the week, her follower count had plummeted by hundreds of thousands. Her apology video, tearful, poorly lit, begging forgiveness, was met with ruthless skepticism. The internet wasn't in the mood for performative contrition. Claudia Reynolds, the attorney in the blazer, had her own reckoning. Her comments about standards came back to haunt her when clients began demanding distance. Her firm, eager to protect its reputation, quietly reassigned her from a high-profile case to administrative review. She kept her job, but the gleam of untouchable prestige had dimmed. And then there was Martin Ellison, the loud consultant. His laughter, his dismissive jabs about Adriana's place near the emergency exit, they became memes, parodies, case studies in arrogance. His consulting firm erased his name from their roster within days. His professional profile vanished as though he had never existed. Justice, in its strange modern form, had arrived through pixels and outrage. But Adriana, she remained untouched. She didn't post a statement. She didn't give an interview. She didn't ride the wave of sudden fame. When cameras waited at the terminal, she walked past them with the same steady steps she had carried through combat zones and silent nights in hostile skies. She owed the world no explanations. Her story was never meant for applause, and that is what made it powerful. Because while the arrogant passengers scrambled to salvage reputations, Adriana embodied something rarer: dignity in silence. The very quality they mistook for weakness was the strength that protected her now. On the day after the flight, in a quiet corner of the terminal, a small moment unfolded that captured everything the internet couldn't. A little girl, no older than 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve. She had seen the videos on the news screens looping near the gates. Her wide eyes turned to Adriana, who was walking with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hoodie tugged down against the chill. "Mom," the girl whispered, "is that the pilot lady?" Her mother glanced at Adriana, recognition softening her features. She didn't answer with words, only nodded, slowly, almost reverently. Adriana paused just long enough to meet the child's eyes. She offered the faintest of smiles, the kind that said yes but also no, because she wasn't just a pilot. She was proof that strength doesn't need to announce itself, that resilience doesn't need medals to shine. Then she kept walking, steady as ever. The crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear, but respect. And when she disappeared into the flow of travelers, she left behind something stronger than headlines or viral clips. She left a message. That true power often wears no uniform. That dignity can survive ridicule. That silence, when chosen, can roar louder than cruelty. And above all, that there are heroes walking quietly among us, unrecognized until the world is forced to see. Adriana Cole didn't need their applause. She had already lived through storms greater than their words. And for anyone who had ever been judged, dismissed, or mocked for being ordinary, her story became a promise whispered into the noise of the world. You are not small. You never were. Stories like Adriana Cole's stay with us because they remind us of something timeless, that appearances can deceive, but character never does. In that airplane cabin, most passengers saw only a woman in a worn hoodie and an old backpack. They judged her worth in seconds, by fabric, by fashion, by silence. But life has a way of turning judgment upside down. The woman dismissed as ordinary was in fact someone extraordinary, a veteran whose quiet strength commanded the respect of elite fighter pilots. And isn't that a lesson for our own time? In today's America, we still live in a culture that prizes surface, clothes, titles, social media numbers. We often forget that the true measure of a person is in their integrity, their resilience, and the way they carry themselves when no applause is present. How many Adriana Coles do we pass by each day at the grocery store, on the bus, or in the waiting room at the doctor's office? People with untold histories, silent sacrifices, and dignity that isn't broadcast. For older generations watching this, perhaps you feel the sting of being overlooked in a world that worships youth and flash. But Adriana's story reminds us, being underestimated does not erase your worth. Sometimes the quietest presence in the room carries the deepest history. And here's a question I'd love to leave with you. How would you have reacted if you had been sitting in that cabin? Would you have joined the laughter, stayed silent, or offered kindness? And beyond that, what does this story tell us about the way we treat veterans, elders, or anyone who doesn't fit society's picture of success? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe our culture has become too quick to judge by appearances? Have you ever been underestimated, only to surprise people later? These are the conversations worth having because they reveal who we are as a community. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If Adriana's story touched you, if it made you think about dignity, resilience, and the unseen heroes among us, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Because in the end, stories like this aren't just about one woman in seat 12F. They are about all of us, learning to see beyond the surface and honoring the quiet strength that shapes our world.